August 1940. The skies above England were burning. The Luftwaffe had declared war on the Royal Air Force, and for weeks, the German bombers had been relentless. German pilots reported that they were destroying RAF airfields faster than the British could rebuild them. German commanders were confident. They believed the RAF was finished. They believed victory was near. They were completely wrong about what was happening beneath the English countryside. The Battle of Britain was reaching its critical phase. German Messerschmitts and bombers attacked RAF bases day after day. Airfields were cratered. Hangars were destroyed. Control towers were reduced to rubble. The casualty lists grew. British pilots were dying. British aircraft were being shot down. To anyone watching from the outside, it seemed like Britain was on the verge of defeat. The Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority over the Channel. German bombers were hitting their targets. The RAF seemed to be losing the ability to defend itself. Victory seemed inevitable for the Germans. The future looked bleak for Britain, but the British were doing something that German intelligence had completely failed to understand. While the Luftwaffe was focusing on the obvious airfields, the RAF was building secret bases that the Germans didn't know existed. These weren't permanent installations. They weren't marked on any map. They weren't defended by anti-aircraft guns. They were simply grass fields in the English countryside, small airfields that appeared to be nothing more than farmland. They had no concrete runways. They had no elaborate infrastructure. They were, in every way, invisible to German reconnaissance aircraft. The concept had been developed by a RAF officer named Air Vice Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Dowding understood something that German military intelligence had missed. He understood that the Luftwaffe was fixated on destroying the big, obvious airfields. The Germans photographed them from the air. The Germans planned their attacks around them. The Germans measured their success by the damage they could inflict on these permanent installations. But what the Germans didn't understand was that the RAF could operate from almost anywhere. You didn't need concrete runways. You didn't need elaborate facilities. You just needed a field that was flat enough for an aircraft to land and take off. Dowding was not a flashy commander. He was methodical and careful. He studied how the Luftwaffe operated. He analyzed German tactics. He recognized that German pilots were focusing their attacks on the most obvious targets. Dowding understood that this represented an opportunity. If the Germans were focused on obvious targets, then the RAF could operate from locations that were not obvious. The RAF could hide in plain sight. Dowding had ordered the creation of what were called satellite airfields. These were small, dispersed bases scattered throughout southern England. They were built in remote locations. They were hidden from the air. They were difficult to find. And, crucially, they were nearly impossible to destroy effectively. Even if a German bomber managed to find one, what was there to bomb? There were no hangars. There were no fuel tanks. There were no obvious military installations. There were just a few buildings hidden in trees and a cleared field where aircraft could land. The satellite airfield strategy was revolutionary for its time. It represented a completely different way of thinking about air defense. Instead of concentrating all resources at a few major bases, the RAF was dispersing resources across dozens of smaller bases. This meant that the Luftwaffe couldn't knock out British air capability by destroying a few key installations. They would have to find and destroy dozens of small, well-hidden airfields. Many of these airfields the Germans didn't even know existed. The strategy turned the traditional approach to air defense completely on its head. The first satellite airfields were built in July and August 1940. They were constructed quickly and quietly. Workers arrived at carefully selected fields. They cleared the grass. They marked out a runway area. They dug slit trenches for personnel. They stored supplies in camouflaged bunkers. They built simple wooden structures to house operation staff and equipment. Then the workers left, and the field looked like nothing more than a farmer's meadow. An RAF Spitfire could land there. Ground crew could service the aircraft. Pilots could rest. Then the Spitfire could take off again. To anyone flying over, it would look like just another field in the English countryside. The RAF's deception strategy went further. Every visible airfield was heavily defended with anti-aircraft guns. Every airfield was surrounded by barrage balloons. Every airfield had obvious air raid shelters and bunkers. The Germans flying reconnaissance missions could see all of this. They could see where the defenses were concentrated. They naturally assumed that the RAF would be trying to defend these obvious locations. What the Germans didn't realize was that many of these airfields had been largely abandoned. The RAF had moved most of its aircraft to the satellite bases. The Germans were attacking empty or nearly empty airfields, while the RAF's real fighting strength was dispersed and hidden across the countryside. One satellite airfield was established near a small village called Hornchurch. The villagers didn't even know the airfield existed. It was completely hidden from the road. It was surrounded by trees and hedgerows. A narrow track led to it, but the track looked like just another country lane. RAF Spitfires would arrive in the darkness. They would land on the grass runway. Ground crew would refuel them and rearm them. Pilots would eat a quick meal and use the facilities. Then they would take off again to meet the German bombers. The entire process might take only 30 minutes. Another satellite airfield was built near Croydon. This one was also hidden in the English countryside. It had no name on any official map. It wasn't listed in any military directory that the Germans could capture. It simply existed, a small clearing in the fields where RAF fighters could operate. When the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance aircraft flew over southern England, they photographed the same airfields over and over. They created maps showing where the RAF defenses were located, but they were photographing mostly empty airfields. The real RAF strength was somewhere else entirely. A third satellite airfield was constructed near Biggin Hill. This location would become one of the most important satellite bases during the Battle of Britain. Biggin Hill had been a major RAF base, but after German attacks damaged the main airfield, operations shifted to the satellite locations nearby. The satellite bases allowed Biggin Hill to continue operating even when the main base was under repair. RAF pilots and ground crew worked around the clock to keep aircraft flying from whatever location was available. German pilots who were shot down and interrogated after their capture were often confused about this. They would say that they had seen RAF fighters appear from nowhere. They would say that they had attacked airfields, but the RAF seemed to have unlimited fighters. They would say that they couldn't understand where the British were getting all these aircraft. The answer was that the RAF had distributed its strength across dozens of hidden bases. The Germans were destroying concrete and steel, but they weren't destroying the RAF's ability to fight. The satellite airfield strategy had been kept completely secret. The British government didn't announce it. The press didn't know about it. Even many British citizens didn't know about it. It was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. German intelligence had no idea it existed. When German commanders looked at their intelligence reports, they saw an RAF that was being systematically destroyed. They saw damage reports from their bomber crews. They saw photographs showing destroyed hangars and cratered runways. They concluded that the RAF was on the verge of collapse. But the truth was completely different. The RAF was adapting. The RAF was learning. The RAF was surviving by being smarter than the Germans expected. Every time the Luftwaffe attacked a major airfield, the RAF absorbed the blow and kept fighting. The aircraft that had been stationed at that airfield were already safe at satellite bases. The damage, while real, was less catastrophic than it appeared. German bombs were destroying infrastructure, but they were not destroying the RAF's ability to conduct air operations. The satellite airfield system represented a victory of mind over matter. The RAF didn't have more resources than the Luftwaffe. The RAF had fewer resources, but the RAF used those resources more cleverly. The RAF thought about the problem differently. The RAF recognized that the traditional approach to air defense was vulnerable and developed an alternative. This alternative turned out to be not just defensible, but superior. September 1940. A careful observer watching the RAF's operations would have noticed something unusual. RAF fighter squadrons would disappear from their main airfields. Ground crew would vanish. Aircraft would be moved to secret locations. Then, hours later, the same squadrons would reappear somewhere else. They would have been serviced and refueled at satellite bases. They would be ready to fight again. But to the Germans, it would look like the RAF had simply moved. The Germans didn't understand the full scope of what was happening. The satellite airfields were not just military facilities. They were integrated into a larger strategy. They were part of a system that included radar stations, control centers, and communication networks. The RAF had pioneered the use of radar to detect incoming German aircraft. Once an aircraft was detected by radar, the information would be passed to control centers. The control centers would direct RAF fighters to intercept the bombers. The fighters would launch from their satellite bases, engage the enemy, and then return to land wherever was convenient. Some would return to their home airfields. Others would land at satellite bases. The system was flexible and adaptive. The command and control network that managed this system was revolutionary for its time. RAF controllers would track incoming German formations on radar. They would calculate the intercept point. They would direct British fighters to that location. The fighters would fight the Germans. Then the controllers would direct them to the nearest available airfield where they could land and refuel. This meant that British pilots could fly multiple sorties in a single day without returning to their home bases. They could operate from any of the dozen or more airfields that were available to them. Squadron leader Robert Doe was a fighter pilot who experienced the satellite airfield system firsthand. Doe flew Spitfires during the Battle of Britain. Doe would launch from his home airfield to intercept German bombers. After the combat engagement, Doe would be directed to a satellite airfield. Doe would land on the grass runway. Ground crew would quickly refuel and rearm his aircraft. Sometimes Doe would have time for a cup of tea. Other times he would be airborne again within minutes. Doe later described how the satellite airfield system had allowed him to fly numerous sorties in a single day. Doe said that pilots flying from traditional airfields would have had to travel much farther to get back to their bases. The satellite airfields meant that pilots could spend more time in the air and less time traveling. The satellite airfield system also had an important psychological component. British pilots knew that even if their home airfield was badly damaged, they had alternatives. They could continue operating. They wouldn't be grounded. German pilots, by contrast, were increasingly anxious. Every time they returned from a bombing run, they were uncertain whether their home airfield would still be operational. Many times, German bombers returned to find their bases heavily damaged or destroyed. German pilots had to land at whatever airfield was available. Damaged aircraft had to be ferried to repair facilities. The entire German system was becoming chaotic. The Germans, however, didn't fully understand the reason for their inability to destroy the RAF. They thought it was because the British were building new aircraft faster than the Germans could destroy them. This was true to an extent. The British aircraft industry was producing fighters, but the bigger reason was the satellite airfield system. The Germans could destroy airfield after airfield, but they couldn't destroy the system itself. The system was dispersed. It was redundant. It was designed to be resilient. One German pilot named Klaus Richter was shot down on September 15, 1940. He was interrogated by British military intelligence officers. Richter told his interrogators that he didn't understand how the RAF kept fighting. He said that his unit had bombed RAF Hornchurch on 3 separate occasions. Each time, the base appeared to be heavily damaged. Yet each time, British fighters appeared again, seemingly minutes later. Richter said he didn't understand where the British were getting these aircraft. He said it was as if the British had bases everywhere. Richter's observation was essentially correct, though he didn't fully understand why. The British did have bases everywhere, or at least everywhere that mattered in southern England. The bases were small and hidden, but they were numerous. The Germans, attacking the obvious installations, were hitting the most visible parts of the system, but not the core of it. It was like trying to defeat a spider by destroying the web, but leaving the spider itself untouched. The Germans were frustrated and confused by an enemy that operated in ways they didn't expect. The satellite airfield system had been implemented gradually throughout August and September 1940. By October, more than 30 satellite airfields were operational. Each airfield could accommodate fighters and provide basic services. Each airfield was connected to the command and control network through radio and telephone. Each airfield was staffed with enough ground crew to service and refuel aircraft. The system was becoming increasingly sophisticated and effective. By October, the system was mature enough to significantly impact the course of the Battle of Britain. German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph the satellite airfields occasionally, but they didn't understand what they were seeing. A photograph would show a cleared field with no obvious military installations. German interpreters would conclude that it was just a field. They wouldn't realize that RAF fighters were operating from it. They wouldn't know that the field had been deliberately cleared to provide a runway. They wouldn't understand that the camouflaged buildings hidden in the trees were actually operation centers and ammunition stores. The British also practiced active deception. fake airfields were built with dummy aircraft made of wood and canvas. These fake airfields looked realistic from the air. German bombers would sometimes attack them, dropping bombs on dummy aircraft and wooden structures. Meanwhile, the real airfields remained hidden and undamaged. The deception strategy was working brilliantly. The Germans were expending effort and resources attacking targets that didn't matter, while the real RAF infrastructure continued to operate. The satellite airfields had been selected with great care. RAF intelligence officers had studied maps of southern England. They had identified locations that were far enough from German invasion routes, but close enough to the coast to intercept German bombers heading for London and other major cities. The locations had to be accessible by road, but not obvious from the air. The locations had to have suitable terrain for aircraft operations. Once a location was selected, RAF engineers would visit the site. They would assess the ground. They would determine what work needed to be done. The construction of the satellite airfields was itself a remarkable feat of organization and secrecy. Teams of workers would arrive at night. They would clear the field of obstacles. They would level the ground where necessary. They would mark out a runway. They would dig bunkers and slit trenches. They would erect camouflage netting over important structures. All of this work had to be done quickly and quietly. The work had to be finished before dawn so that German reconnaissance aircraft wouldn't see fresh construction. The workers had to be trustworthy. The location of each airfield had to be kept secret. The satellite airfields were designed to be maintained with minimal personnel. A typical satellite airfield had only 20 to 30 ground crew members. These men had to be trained to perform multiple tasks. They had to be able to refuel aircraft. They had to be able to rearm aircraft. They had to be able to repair battle damage. They had to be able to provide basic medical care. They had to be ready to maintain operations even under air attack. These ground crew members were highly trained and highly motivated. They understood that their work was crucial to keeping RAF fighters in the air. October 1940. The Battle of Britain was entering its final phase. German commanders were beginning to realize that their strategy wasn't working. The RAF was not being destroyed. Despite weeks of intensive bombing, RAF fighters continued to appear. The Luftwaffe had destroyed many airfields, but the RAF was still able to operate. German pilots were frustrated. German commanders were confused. Something was clearly wrong with their intelligence assessment. The satellite airfield system was the reason. The RAF had adapted to the threat. The RAF had built an infrastructure that was resilient and difficult to destroy. While the Luftwaffe was focusing on destroying visible facilities, the RAF was operating from hidden locations that the Germans didn't know existed. The result was that the Luftwaffe found itself unable to achieve its objective. The RAF could not be defeated by bombing raids on airfields because the RAF was no longer concentrated at major airfields. The RAF was dispersed. German pilots who returned from bombing runs reported that they had destroyed airfields. Photographs showed cratered runways and destroyed hangars. By any objective measure, the Luftwaffe was damaging British airfield infrastructure, but the RAF kept fighting. This confusion led to disputes among German commanders about the actual state of British air power. Some commanders believed that the RAF was on the verge of collapse. Other commanders believed that British aircraft production was simply replacing losses faster than the Luftwaffe could inflict them. Neither assessment was fully correct. The real reason was the satellite airfield system. The strategic implications of this became clear as the weeks progressed. The Luftwaffe was unable to achieve air superiority over England because it was unable to destroy the RAF's ability to operate. Even if the Luftwaffe had destroyed every major RAF airfield, the RAF would have continued operating from satellite bases. The Luftwaffe's strategy of defeating Britain by bombing the RAF into submission was fundamentally flawed because it was based on an incomplete understanding of British air operations. RAF pilots themselves understood the importance of the satellite airfield system. Pilot Officer Richard Crompton was a fighter pilot who flew Spitfires from multiple bases during the Battle of Britain. After the war, Crompton wrote about his experiences. He described how the satellite airfield system had allowed pilots to continue fighting despite the intensive German bombing campaign. Crompton wrote that pilots felt more confident knowing that they had multiple airfields available. Crompton wrote that if your home airfield was damaged, you knew you could land at a satellite base and continue operations. Crompton said the system had been invaluable to RAF morale and effectiveness. The psychological impact on German pilots was equally important. German pilots began to realize that they couldn't permanently disable the RAF by bombing airfields. No matter how many airfields they destroyed, RAF fighters continued to appear. German pilots began to feel that the task was impossible. The RAF seemed to have unlimited aircraft and unlimited airfields. German pilot confidence, which had been high at the beginning of the campaign, began to deteriorate. German pilots started to question whether they could actually win. The confidence that had characterized German pilots in August began to fade. By late October 1940, German commanders were making the decision to change strategy. The day bombing campaign was clearly not achieving its objectives. The Luftwaffe was losing too many aircraft. The RAF was not being decisively defeated. German commanders decided to shift to night bombing. This change in strategy represented an admission that the original plan had failed. The original plan had assumed that the RAF would be destroyed by bombing attacks on its airfields. This assumption had been wrong. The RAF had proven to be too resilient. The night bombing campaign would continue for months. German bombers would attack British cities at night, trying to destroy industrial capacity and civilian morale. But the night bombing campaign was a different war. It was not about defeating the RAF. It was about trying to destroy British will to continue fighting. The RAF had survived the day bombing campaign. The RAF had achieved victory in the Battle of Britain. The satellite airfield system had been crucial to that victory. By November 1940, the Battle of Britain was effectively over. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its objective of making Britain vulnerable to invasion. German commanders had to accept that the battle had been lost. The RAF had survived. The RAF had adapted. The RAF had won. The satellite airfield system had been crucial to this victory. The system had allowed the RAF to continue operating despite intensive German bombing. The system had allowed the RAF to concentrate its strength where it was needed. The system had allowed the RAF to be flexible and adaptive, while the Germans were rigid and predictable. The Germans had attacked what they could see, but they had failed to attack the real source of British air power, which was the dispersed, hidden network of satellite airfields. The costs had been significant. RAF pilots had been killed. RAF aircraft had been destroyed. The British people had endured hardship, but Britain had survived. The RAF had survived. The RAF had won the battle for air superiority over Britain. This victory would prove to be crucial to the eventual outcome of the war. The satellite airfield strategy represented a fundamental innovation in air warfare. It challenged the conventional wisdom about how air forces should be organized. Traditionally, air forces had concentrated their resources at major, well-developed airfields. These airfields had permanent infrastructure. They had elaborate facilities. They had large numbers of aircraft concentrated in a small area, but this concentration made them vulnerable to attack. A few well-placed bombs could damage the airfield and make it unusable for weeks or months. The RAF's approach was different. Instead of concentrating resources, the RAF dispersed them. Instead of building elaborate facilities, the RAF built simple ones that could be quickly repaired or replaced. Instead of hoping that anti-aircraft defenses could protect airfields, the RAF simply moved its aircraft to locations where they were less likely to be attacked. The strategy was less elegant than traditional approaches, but it was more practical and more effective. The strategy turned the tables on the Luftwaffe. Air Vice Marshal Dowding's leadership during this period was crucial. Dowding had the courage to implement a strategy that was unconventional. Dowding had to convince his subordinates that the satellite airfield system would work. Dowding had to convince the British government that resources should be allocated to building these hidden bases. Dowding had to maintain this strategy even as it was being criticized by some as too radical. Dowding's confidence in his strategy proved to be justified. History would vindicate Dowding's decision. The satellite airfield system also represented an important lesson about the nature of air warfare. Air warfare, it turned out, was not primarily about destroying enemy aircraft in the air. It was about disrupting the enemy's ability to generate air power. By dispersing its aircraft across many small airfields, the RAF made it difficult for the Luftwaffe to disrupt British air operations. The Luftwaffe could bomb airfields, but each airfield was small enough that the damage could be quickly repaired or bypassed. The Luftwaffe could destroy aircraft, but new aircraft could be generated from other locations. The system proved to be more resilient than anyone had expected. The concept of dispersal would become increasingly important as the war progressed. By the end of the war, the principle of dispersing military resources to make them harder to destroy had become standard military doctrine. Air forces around the world recognized that concentration of resources could be a vulnerability. The RAF's innovation during the Battle of Britain had shown that dispersal could be an effective defensive strategy. This lesson would influence military thinking for decades to come. After the war, air forces around the world studied the satellite airfield concept and adapted it to modern conditions. Modern air forces maintain multiple airfields that can be used to disperse aircraft. Modern air forces practice operating from austere locations with minimal facilities. Modern air forces understand that concentration of resources can be a vulnerability. Modern air forces build redundancy and resilience into their operations. All of these practices trace their origins back to the RAF's satellite airfield system developed during the Battle of Britain. The RAF personnel who developed, implemented, and maintained the satellite airfield system during the Battle of Britain made a crucial contribution to British victory. They didn't win by shooting down more enemy aircraft. They didn't win by having superior aircraft. They didn't win by having superior pilots. They won by thinking differently about how air operations should be organized. They won by adapting to the threat. They won by developing systems that were more resilient and more flexible than the enemy's systems. The satellite airfield story also represents an important recognition of the role of organization and system design in military effectiveness. Military success, it turned out, was not just about having superior weapons or superior pilots. Military success depended on having superior organization, superior tactics, and superior strategic thinking. The RAF had these things. The Luftwaffe did not. The result was that despite having achieved initial tactical successes, the Luftwaffe was defeated by an enemy that thought and organized more effectively. What made the satellite airfield system work was not just the physical infrastructure. It was also the command and control system that managed it. The RAF had to be able to direct fighters from one airfield to another. The RAF had to know which airfields were operational at any given time. The RAF had to be able to service and refuel aircraft at multiple locations. The RAF had to be able to communicate between airfields and with aircraft in the air. This required a sophisticated system of coordination and communication. The RAF's Fighter Command, under the leadership of Dowding, had developed this system. Fighter Command had established a network of operations centers that received information from radar stations and from aircraft in the air. The operations centers would process this information and issue orders to fighter squadrons. Fighter squadrons would launch from their designated airfields to intercept enemy formations. After the engagement, the fighters would be directed to whichever airfield was most convenient and most secure. The system allowed for efficient use of resources and maximum operational flexibility. This system allowed the RAF to concentrate its strength at the point of need while maintaining the ability to operate from multiple locations. If one airfield was attacked and damaged, operations could shift to another airfield. If too many fighters returned to one airfield, they could be directed to another. The system was flexible and adaptive. It was designed to continue operating even under stress. The system could handle disruptions and continue to function. The ground crews who staffed the satellite airfields were crucial to the system's success. These men were not concentrated at major bases where they were vulnerable to bombing. They were dispersed across the countryside at small, hidden airfields. They had to be able to service and refuel aircraft with minimal facilities. They had to be able to repair battle damage. They had to be able to continue operations even when they were exhausted and frightened. The ground crews, often overlooked in historical accounts of the Battle of Britain, were essential to the RAF's victory. Without them, the satellite airfield system would not have worked. Group Captain Richard Darwin was responsible for managing satellite airfields in the southern sector of Fighter Command. Darwin later described the challenges of maintaining the system. Darwin wrote that ground crew members had to work in primitive conditions. They had to work at night to maintain secrecy. They had to work quickly to get aircraft serviced and back in the air. Darwin wrote that the ground crews were the unsung heroes of the Battle of Britain. Without them, the satellite airfield system would not have worked. Darwin's recognition of the ground crew's contribution was important and deserved. The pilots who flew from the satellite airfields also had to adapt. Pilots were used to operating from established bases with established procedures. Now they had to land on grass fields and operate from minimal facilities. Some pilots were uncomfortable with this. They worried that grass fields were not adequate for high-performance fighters. They worried that operating from hidden, minimally developed bases would compromise operational effectiveness. But pilots quickly adapted. They learned that grass fields were perfectly adequate for operating Spitfires and Hurricanes. They learned that the satellite airfield system was actually more effective than the traditional concentrated approach. Pilots became advocates for the system. The supply and logistics system that supported the satellite airfields was itself a remarkable achievement. Supplies had to be delivered to each satellite airfield. Ammunition had to be stored. Fuel had to be stockpiled. Spare parts had to be available. All of this had to be done discreetly, without drawing attention from German reconnaissance aircraft. The RAF logistics personnel had to develop new procedures and new systems to support the satellite airfields. They had to create supply routes that were not obvious to German intelligence. The logisticians worked behind the scenes, but their work was crucial. The RAF also had to develop procedures for emergency operations. What would happen if an airfield was captured during a German invasion? What would happen if communications between airfields was disrupted? The RAF developed contingency plans for all of these scenarios. The plans ensured that operations could continue even if parts of the system were damaged or destroyed. The redundancy built into the system meant that the RAF could continue fighting even if significant parts of the infrastructure were compromised. The planners had thought through the worst-case scenarios. Communication systems that connected the satellite airfields were crucial. Telephone lines had to be laid to connect each airfield to fighter command. Radio systems had to be installed to communicate with aircraft. Backup systems had to be established in case primary systems failed. The communications personnel worked to maintain these systems despite German bombing. The communications infrastructure was as important as the airfields themselves. The RAF also had to train personnel to operate the satellite airfields. Ground crew members had to be trained to service aircraft in austere conditions. Officers had to be trained to manage operations at satellite bases. Pilots had to be trained to operate from multiple airfields. The training programs were intensive. The personnel had to understand not just their specific tasks, but how their tasks fit into the overall system. The training was crucial to making the system work. December 1940. The Battle of Britain was definitively over. The Luftwaffe had called off the day bombing campaign. The RAF had survived. The RAF had won. German commanders would later acknowledge that the RAF had successfully resisted the Luftwaffe's assault. The satellite airfield system had been a crucial factor in this success. The strategy had worked even better than Dowding had hoped. The victory came at a cost. The RAF had lost many pilots. British aircraft production, while substantial, had been strained by the need to replace losses. British ground infrastructure had been damaged. British cities had been damaged by German bombing. The British people had endured hardship, but Britain had survived. The RAF had survived. The RAF had won the battle for air superiority over Britain. This victory would prove crucial to the eventual outcome of the war. Prime Minister Winston Churchill recognized the importance of the RAF's victory. Churchill famously said that never in the field of human conflict had so much been owed by so many to so few. Churchill was referring to the RAF pilots. But the victory had been achieved by more than just the pilots. The victory had been achieved by the ground crews, the logisticians, the engineers, and the commanders who had developed and implemented the satellite airfield strategy. Churchill himself did not fully understand the role of the satellite airfield system in the RAF's victory, but the victory was real and decisive. In the years after the Battle of Britain, British military commanders would often cite the satellite airfield strategy as one of the keys to victory. Air Vice Marshal Dowding would receive recognition for his leadership and his strategic innovations. The satellite airfield concept would be studied in military academies. It would influence Air Force doctrine for generations to come. Dowding would eventually be recognized as one of the great military commanders of the Second World War. His strategic innovations had proven to be more important than tactical victories in the air. German military historians who studied the Battle of Britain after the war would eventually come to understand the significance of the satellite airfield system. They would realize that they had been fighting against an enemy that had developed a response to their strategy. They would understand that their intelligence assessments had been incomplete. They would recognize that the RAF had been more adaptable and more innovative than they had expected. German military science had not anticipated this response. German General Adolf Galland, who had commanded Luftwaffe fighter units during the Battle of Britain, was interrogated after the war. Galland was asked why the Luftwaffe had failed to defeat the RAF. Galland explained that the RAF had been more resilient than expected. Galland mentioned that RAF fighters continued to appear even after airfields had been attacked and damaged. Galland noted that the RAF seemed to have more aircraft available than German intelligence had estimated. Galland did not fully understand the satellite airfield system, but he recognized that something about the RAF's organization had made it difficult to defeat. Galland acknowledged that German intelligence had underestimated the RAF. Another German general, Karl Korten, who had been involved in planning the air campaign against Britain, was also interviewed after the war. Korten acknowledged that the German intelligence assessment of RAF capabilities had been flawed. Korten said that the Germans had underestimated the British ability to absorb damage and continue operating. Korten noted that the RAF had adapted more effectively than the Luftwaffe had expected. Korten's assessment, while not specifically mentioning the satellite airfield system, recognized that the RAF had an organizational advantage that had not been anticipated. Korten's acknowledgement was an important step in understanding why the campaign had failed. The satellite airfield system represented something important about the nature of conflict. It showed that adapting to an enemy's strategy could be more effective than trying to outfight them with superior force. The Luftwaffe had tried to defeat the RAF through bombing. The RAF had responded not by building more aircraft, but by reorganizing how those aircraft operated. The RAF had won not through superior military hardware, but through superior military thinking. The lesson was important and would be remembered. The story of the satellite airfield system represents a crucial lesson about military innovation. The RAF faced a threat that required an innovative response. The traditional approach to air defense, concentrating aircraft at major airfields and hoping to defend them with anti-aircraft guns and fighters, was not adequate against the Luftwaffe's assault. The RAF needed something different. The RAF developed something different. The RAF implemented it successfully. Success came through innovation. The innovation was not a new weapon. It was not a new aircraft. It was a new way of thinking about how to organize air operations. It was a new way of thinking about how to be resilient in the face of attack. It was a new way of thinking about how to concentrate strength without being vulnerable to attack. These ideas would prove to be more important than any individual weapon or any individual aircraft. Ideas and organization mattered more than hardware. The satellite airfield system also represented a recognition of the importance of deception and concealment in military operations. The system worked partly because it was hidden from the Germans. The Germans didn't know the satellite airfields existed. The Germans didn't know where the RAF was operating from. The Germans were attacking in the wrong places. Meanwhile, the RAF was operating from locations that the Germans didn't realize existed. The secrecy and deception were crucial to the system's success. The hidden airfields were the secret weapon. In the decades after the war, military forces around the world studied the satellite airfield concept and adapted it to modern conditions. During the Cold War, NATO developed elaborate plans for dispersed aircraft operations. Aircraft would be dispersed to numerous small airfields in case of war with the Soviet Union. The principle was the same as it had been during the Battle of Britain. Dispersal provided protection against attack. The RAF's wartime innovation became standard peacetime doctrine. Modern air forces continue to apply the principles of the satellite airfield system. The United States Air Force maintains the capability to operate from austere airfields. NATO regularly conducts exercises simulating dispersed air operations. The principle of dispersing military resources to make them harder to destroy remains a cornerstone of modern Air Force doctrine. The RAF's innovation during the Battle of Britain had proven to be enduringly valuable. The principle is still relevant more than 80 years later. The RAF personnel who developed, implemented, and maintained the satellite airfield system during the Battle of Britain made a crucial contribution to British victory. They didn't win by shooting down more enemy aircraft. They didn't win by having superior aircraft. They didn't win by having superior pilots. They won by thinking differently about how air operations should be organized. They won by adapting to the threat. They won by developing systems that were more resilient and more flexible than the enemy's systems. Their achievement deserves to be remembered. The satellite airfield story reminds us that military innovation is not always about technology. Sometimes it's about organization. Sometimes it's about thinking differently about problems. Sometimes it's about adapting to threats rather than trying to overcome them with brute force. The RAF adapted. The RAF innovated. The RAF survived. And in surviving, the RAF demonstrated principles of military organization and strategic thinking that remain relevant to this day. The hidden airfields in the English countryside that rose from the fields to defend Britain remain a symbol of British ingenuity and resilience. They remain a reminder that sometimes victory goes to those who think most creatively about their problems. They remain a reminder that in warfare, as in life, adaptation and innovation can be more important than sheer force. The RAF had faced extinction. The RAF had innovated. The RAF had survived. And in that survival, the RAF had learned lessons that would shape military air operations for generations to come. The victory in the Battle of Britain was not inevitable. It was the result of inspired leadership, innovative thinking, and determined implementation. It was the result of pilots and ground crew working together under extraordinary stress. It was the result of the British people's determination to resist. But perhaps most importantly, it was the result of the RAF's willingness to think differently about how air operations should be organized. The satellite airfield system had been the difference between victory and defeat. The system had made the difference. Today, more than 80 years after the Battle of Britain, the satellite airfield system is still studied in military academies around the world. The system is still referenced as an example of how to achieve resilience and flexibility in military operations. The system is still cited as evidence that organizational innovation can be as important as technological innovation. The RAF's achievement during the Battle of Britain was not just a victory for Britain. It was a victory for human ingenuity and for the principle that thinking creatively about problems can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The achievement remains inspiring. The British people should remember the satellite airfield system as part of their military heritage. The system represents the best of British innovation and adaptation. The system represents the ability of the British to meet challenges creatively. The system represents the determination of the British to survive and prevail against the odds. The satellite airfields were invisible to the enemy, but visible in their effects. They changed the course of history and deserve to be remembered as such.